Welcome back to the Opium War. The McCartney mission did not solve the issues that the British were so frustrated about. Afterwards, they were back in Canton. They were still restricted to that area for trade. They couldn't trade in other cities. They couldn't have a permanent ambassador. And the frustrations maintained themselves. The British sent another embassy in 1816, and that one failed even worse than the McCartney mission due to disagreements about the kowtow issue and other court protocol issues. The British ambassador didn't even get to see the emperor. So the British then became increasingly frustrated. Why were they frustrated? Well, we've talked about some of the issues, but another issue that we really haven't touched on is the balance of trade. The British wanted tea down here in Guangzhou, and what they had to trade for it was basically silver. The British would have liked to have British manufacturers like woolen goods and other things, but that didn't really happen. A large amount of what they traded was silver. And this was one of the issues that the British, that Europeans had in general in their trade with China, going back to antiquity. Even in Roman times, people talked about how silver was flowing all the way to the east. China always had a positive balance of trade, at least in terms of silver. Silver flowed to China and away from the West. Now, that wasn't always a problem. But the British were finding it kind of frustrating, and they wanted to be able to arouse new markets in China. Now, I should also say, the British were able to sell in China a number of other things, including Indian cottons and things like that. But nonetheless, the trade balance, silver flowed into China, and the British were frustrated by that and wanted to find something else. And never had they really been able to do that until finally they found a market in opium. Now, opium, as you probably know, comes from this flower, the opium poppy. And you basically take this poppy where the seed pods are going to form, and you cut to the side. I think I have right here. So if you see this kind of seed pod, if you ever want to raise opium, this is your chance. You kind of cut into it, and out of it leaks a kind of milk. You collect that milk, you process it. It's very laborious, but ultimately, once it's distilled and processed, not distilled, but once it's processed, it becomes a powerful narcotic. The opium binds to the opioid receptors in people's brains, and as the brain kind of, and it feels really good. Opioid receptors are responsible for the feeling that we get after we have sex, or after we go for a jog, or when we're just feeling tired and good. Often those are endorphins, right? So opium kind of supercharges, any kind of opioid kind of supercharges those circuits. But the problem with that is, of course, as addiction works, as the neurons begin to adjust to that supercharging, they decrease the number of opioid receptors. Because they want to regain their balance. The brain wants to regain its balance. And as a result, you need more opium. And so you become physically dependent, physically addicted. And stopping can cause horrible, horrible feelings like the worst cold you've ever had. I don't have personal experience with opium withdrawal, but it's by all accounts a very nasty experience to go through. So opium addiction is no joke. And the British, now opium was known for millennia, basically, back to ancient Greek times, and it was known also in China. So one of the questions that we need to ask is, why is it that at a certain point, opium becomes very cheap and becomes a mainstay of Chinese trade, of British trade to China? Well, opium had been used in China going back to the 600s, even the 500s. There's some evidence of it. So yeah, this is a real question. Why would it happen that that in the 19th century it suddenly surges to importance? And you can see, if you look at the data, opium trade is about 1,000 chests around 1773. So when the United States of America is born, opium is being traded around 1,000 chests per year. But you can see how quickly, in the early 1820s, how it shoots upwards by a factor of 10 and then continues to rise through the 19th century. The British weren't necessarily the first to begin exporting opium. The Dutch did it, the Danes, the Americans. The rate of opium increases dramatically. So why is that? Well, one reason is that the British are taking over large parts of India. And in India, as the British monopolize the opium purchases by controlling the land, they are able, through enforcing competition between their sellers, to decrease the price. So opium becomes a massive cash crop. And by 1800 or so, 4,000 chests per year. At 1819 or so, this is when the British really kind of consolidate control over the opium growing regions. Prices dropped, and as prices dropped, as we know from economics, when prices go down, demand goes up. It's easier to afford. As one agent said around 1838, the year before the Opium War, when 40,000 chests of opium were being sold yearly, he said, opium is like gold. I can sell it any time. By that time, opium has become the world's single most valuable commodity trade. I'm going to say that again. In the 19th century, by the middle of the 19th century, opium was the single most valuable commodity trade in the world, more than cotton, more than silk or anything else, or tea. Opium. And opium changed the balance of trade. So you can see here this dramatic increase in opium exports. The Opium War is right here in 1839. So you can see how between 1820 or so, the amount of opium sold into China due to the decrease in prices shoots upward. And here is an opium fleet. You could see like just how massive these large ships bringing opium out. And they, since opium was technically illegal, they cooperated with local smugglers who would come out in little boats and pick up the opium and then take it to the rest of the distribute it. So opium changed the balance of trade. From 1800 to 1810, China had a balance of trade of $26 million. So that doesn't seem like much these days. But it was a huge amount in the 19th century. And it was a surplus. So China had a $26 million trade surplus. That means $26 million more silver flowed into China than out. A decade later, that situation had reversed itself. There was a much higher deficit, $38 million trade deficit. So this was the first time that China bought more than it sold, at least in terms of silver, with the West, since ancient times. And opium, this huge amount of opium flowing into China, had tremendous effects. It had effects on opium smokers, rich smokers, and you could be poor. In fact, often you might start rich and end poor. And this is an image from the early 20th century, and another one from the early 20th century. It's hard to say how many people actually took opium, but later in the 1800s, it's estimated that 10% of the population smoked opium, 3 to 5% may have been addicted, and in the early 1800s, or the first half of the 1800s, that number was rather less. But more important is the perception of opium addiction and opium use. It was a visible presence in urban centers and along trade routes, especially in the coastal areas where there was so much trade and where population was concentrated. Opium dens abounded, and the big cities had the most addicts. It's estimated that the city of Suzhou, a major city on the lower Yangtze region, had 100,000 addicts, or at least 100,000 regular users. And that's a huge amount, considering that the population of Suzhou in those years was somewhere around 500,000. So these figures we have to be careful with. We really don't have, they didn't do censuses of opium addicts, but people who've really looked at it it's very clear that opium was beginning to be a serious problem. And one of the problems was that government officials began to become addicted. And if you've ever dealt with addiction in your life, or that means either being addicted yourself or knowing someone who has been addicted to anything, alcohol, but especially hard drugs like opium, you know that when someone gets to the point where they need that substance because their brain has changed, right, they will do almost anything to get it. And that may even include selling their children, that may include stealing from their family, etc. So these addictions began to be seen as a serious problem. And a moral poison. Opium began to be seen as a moral poison. If we look at this this quote from Imperial Censor Yuan Yuli in 1836, 3 years before the Opium War, he writes, "Fathers will no longer be able to admonish their wives, masters will no longer be able to restrain their servants, and teachers will no longer be able to train their pupils. It would mean the end of the life of the people and the destruction of the soul of the nation." If you look at this quote closely, what you can see is a fear of an unraveling of the relationships that hold life together. In Confucian terms, the idea that fathers will no longer be able to admonish their wives or their sons means that there's a perception that society is beginning to unravel. Confucianism, the basic philosophy of China in the imperial period, held that so long as the different parts of society upheld their relations to each other, as long as sons obeyed their fathers and fathers took care of their sons, etc., then the society would be stable. But if those bonds should fray, then chaos could break loose. And opium was seen to be a poison that was threatening to do this. And so it became utterly necessary, or it seems to be increasingly necessary, to do something about the opium. I should also say there was another issue, and that was that opium, possibly, we don't know for sure, but we believe that opium may have caused inflation because so much silver was flowing out of China. The price of silver went up in China. So, less silver, supply and demand, price of silver goes up. And that was a problem because most people had to pay taxes in silver, but received wages, etc., and income in copper, and so or in copper cash, which wasn't always copper. And copper cash, if you have seen classical Chinese money, it's sort of a round coin with a square hole in the middle. This is a sort of standard copper coin. Silver itself wasn't coined a lot of the time, but copper was. And the idea was that usually 1,000 copper cash and a big string of copper cash, 1,000 of them was equal to a tal of silver. A tal is roughly an ounce. A liang is the Chinese word. But that balance changed. And halfway through the 19th century, just before the Opium War, you needed 650 more copper cash, so 1,650 copper cash for a liang of silver. This meant that basically people were having to pay more copper cash for the same amount of silver and yet pay the same amount of taxes. This caused some hardship. So anyway, a lot of problems were being caused by opium, and so this man, the Dao Guang Emperor, decided he needed to do something about it. Dao Guang is an interesting guy, but we don't really have too much time for him. This guy, however, Lin Zexu, becomes a very important part of the story. Dao Guang, in the 1630s, begins to ask officials, and people in his court begin to ask officials, to speculate on how to stop the opium problem. What are we going to do about this horrible substance coming in? And there was a debate about drugs, and a debate that in certain ways took on qualities of debates today about drugs, legalization versus keeping things totally illegal, etc. And I don't know how you come down on the question of whether drugs should be legalized or kept illegal, but there are arguments on both sides. Arguments for some kind of tolerance or decriminalization, I guess you could say, are pretty good, and people have countries that have experimented with that, such as Portugal and the Netherlands, parts of Switzerland, have found that by bringing out the problems of addiction and decoupling it from criminality, you can actually solve a lot of problems. So the same kind of questions, the same kind of arguments were being made around this time. People were suggesting if we legalize opium, we can tax it, and we can use the income from that taxation to treat the people, and also to give more income to the throne. Bringing it out into the open, it allows it to be controlled more. But others, of course, and more people, argued that opium was immoral and that legalization would just lead to more use, and they proposed the death sentence just for addicts, just for using it. So Lin Zexu came along, and he proposed a different thing. So Lin Zexu is quite an important figure. He's seen as an anti-imperial figure. There's a statue of him in New York City's Chinatown, a pioneer in the war against drugs. And indeed, like literally, the Opium War was a war on drugs. But of course, the people who fought against the drugs didn't do very well, which is often the case when you go to war on drugs. I'm being facetious. I think in this case, it would have been possible for the Chinese to win, which is a minority opinion, but I do believe it's true. Anyway, Lin Zexu is often seen sort of as a hero. But he was a high official. He had passed the examinations quite young, and anyway, his proposals captured the attention of the emperor, because he believed that yes, opium addicts, you had to talk about their psychology, that we needed to treat them. They needed treatment centers, but he also said, if they are given the option to get well, but they continue to do opium, then kill them. Fear of death would help them quit. Now, anyone who knows addicts, has had experience with addiction, knows that doesn't quite work. But in any way, the thing that seems to have captured the emperor's attention most about his proposals was that he said, the problem isn't just here in China, isn't just the people in China using opium. The problem is the foreigners bringing this poison in. And so he said, we need to cut off the source of opium by going against the smugglers and the people who buy it from the British, but also making the British not bring the opium in the first place. And so in 1839, he arrives in Canton as the, quote, Imperial Commissioner for Frontier Defense, with a mission of radically severing the trunk from the roots and getting rid of the opium problem. And he, first of all, went after after smugglers and stuff like that. He tried to clean up the Chinese issue, and the British very soon began to realize that this guy was serious. Prices for opium began to decrease, which in their case wasn't good, because they wanted to sell the opium that they had in stock. But the problem seemed to be staying on the Chinese side until Lin Zexu began to insist that they hand over all the opium and promise not to bring any more opium, the British. And the British refused at first, so he surrounded their factories, the factories beneath the walls of Canton where the British lived. He basically cut them off and insisted that they hand over the opium. The British, trapped inside, eventually agreed, because the English commander promised the merchants, the opium merchants, that he would, that the British crown, would actually reimburse them. And they were like, oh, well, they'll reimburse me at a better price than I'd be able to sell. Anyway, here, have my opium. And so 20,000 chests, huge amounts, 2.8 million pounds of opium. I mean, pounds of opium. So when we hear about a major drug bust, 400 pounds seems like a big deal. 2.8 million pounds of opium. Now, opium is less intense. You need more opium than you do morphine, for example, or heroin to produce the same effect. But nonetheless, this is a huge, huge amount. It's a year's worth of opium that the British hope to make fortunes on. So he gets the opium, and then destroys it with lime and flushes it into the river and holds a ceremony to apologize to the river for for polluting it. And he writes a letter to Queen Victoria. If you want to pause and read that, you're welcome to. It's kind of delightful. The letter never gets to her, though, because events begin to take on their own, let's say, their own momentum. He at first thinks that he succeeded. He writes back to the emperor and says, the barbarians have been forced to submit, awed by Chinese moral rectitude and firmness. But the British were not actually ready to submit. And what were they not ready to submit to? They had given away the opium, but they refused to sign bonds promising not to sell opium. Many of them did. Most of them did. And because the bonds said, a bond basically just an agreement, a contract, if I sell Chinese opium, I agree that I will be held liable by Chinese law and can be tried in the Chinese court and proven guilty. So the British refused to do this. Some of them wanted to, some of them actually insisted on doing that, and actually the British commander fired on British ships and fired on Chinese ships protecting those British ships who wanted to basically sign this thing so they could trade other things. And in fact, one of the earliest battles in the Opium War was British trying to get at their own people who were protected by Chinese ships. Anyway, the battles of the Opium War, starting in 1839, quickly spread beyond Canton. The initial battles were around here, but the British sent a fleet. They sent a warship and troops. Now this was an imperial response. A British, not imperial, I'm sorry. Actually, the British queen does not become an emperor until rather later, but she is. I mean, you could say that the British had an empire, but we can say an imperial response. The British response was a concerted response by the crown. They sent hundreds, thousands of troops and warships all the way around the Cape of Good Hope to China. Now, it was also a very contentious debate about doing this. Many people in Britain thought it was wrong, just as Lin Zexu did, for the British to sell this poison into China. They realized that opium was a bad thing. They even printed or reprinted Chinese books in Great Britain talking about the evils of opium and why it was wrong for the British to sell opium there. In any case, after this debate, the crown came down very firmly on the side of fighting against the Chinese. And the reasoning, there were all sorts of debates, is quite interesting in its own. But we won't go into that. Let's talk about the fighting, because that is sort of one of the interesting things. Why did the British win so handily? After all, the Qing had been, for hundreds of years, the most powerful, unassailable, power in East Asia, in Asia as a whole, basically. So how did the British beat them so handily? And here are some kind of caricatures from the Opium War from the Chinese side. But one of the major factors was steamships. The Nemesis, which is here, is the first steamer that made the route all the way from England to the east, to East Asia, all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. It almost didn't make it, but it was an iron-hulled steamship. And you can see it still has masts and stuff, because the engines were kind of not as efficient, and there wasn't as much fuel as you'd hope in many places. There were no fueling stations at the infrastructure at that point. But it did enormous damage. Partly it did damage because it could sail against the wind, right? It didn't need wind. Partly it did damage because it wasn't so deeply hulled as other ships. This typical British East India ship had a very deep hull. That means it rode very deep in the water, which meant that it was great in the ocean, in the open ocean. But as you got close to coasts, it couldn't maneuver very well, and it had to stay out of the shallows. And the Chinese had been used in skirmishing with Europeans to just taking the action sort of close to a shallow place. They couldn't do that with the Nemesis. It was able to sail almost anywhere. It also could tow other ships up, and in fact, the British took the fight from Canton up the coast into the Yangtze Delta, and this is what terrified the Qing. There were fights in various different places, and Lin Zexu had promised that the barbarians had been contained, and then suddenly the barbarians are showing up, or the British are showing up throughout the Chinese coast. This was very frightening. So that the steamship played a very important role in the Opium War, and it was noticed. So this is a scroll that talks about steamships. The fire ship is of a warship's make. Its length is 300 feet and more. Its height and breadth are 30 and more. Through its iron case, it is firm and strong. Its body colored round with black, and on each side it has a wheel, which is moved by burning coal, and turns like a galloping horse, if the wind be for or against it. From its head to its tail, it's girt with guns. Its shape and fashion astonish mankind. So they had a steamship, but they also had other things. They had guns, new kinds of guns known as either howitzers or carronades. Well, these are two different types of guns, and they were quite light artillery. And this is a famous, very sad incident in the city of Ningbo, a major city in Zhejiang province on the coast, where the Qing mounted a massive counterattack once the British had sort of taken over the city, and in a certain battle, the British just set up a howitzer of this type and just fired it, and the Qing troops kept pouring in, and getting destroyed. It was worse. Some officers who were there on the British side had witnessed some of the worst battles of the Napoleonic War, including Badajoz in Spain, where just so many people were slaughtered, and they said it was as bad as that or worse. So it wasn't just the steamship. There were other things happening in Britain too. Also, the muskets were very effective. So the British won very easily. So the question is why and how? How did the British gain this advantage? People have, and this is a historiographical debate, it's often called the Great Divergence debate. So how and why did Great Britain and Europe in general diverge and kind of become more powerful than China, which seemed, from the perspective of, maybe if you look around 1500 or 1600, this doesn't seem like a very likely thing to happen. China is definitely caught up with, maybe ahead of the West in many, many different measures. So why and how? And it's a huge debate that has generated, this is just a small number of the books, and there's literally hundreds of articles. But let's focus on the steamship, because on steam power. How does the steam engine work? The first commercial steam engine was Newcomen's atmospheric engine of 1712. And if you look at how it works, it's called atmospheric because we may think that we understand how steam engines work, but it's a little more, much more difficult to make one than it might seem. The Chinese had actually had steam engines. The Qing court had steam engines demonstrated to it in the 17th century. So, and the principles were kind of known that when you heat up gas, it expands, and that can be a source of energy. But to turn that into a commercially viable product was a completely different prospect. So, and the atmospheric engine finally did it. And the atmospheric engine depends on, if you look at the power actually is produced, like this is a pump that's drawing water out of the well, and so the heavy lifting is on the upstroke, right? That is when the chamber here is emptied of hot air, so the air becomes blue, right? And it's the atmospheric pressure pushing down into the vacuum that really drives it. So it's based on understanding how that we are living at the bottom of a thick, thick sea of atmosphere that air pushes back at you. Now, this is this exact same insight that was responsible for the new kinds of artillery that were so effective against that slaughtered all these people. This howitzer, the discovery of atmosphere and of the speed of sound, basically, that there was enough resistance that that if you try to fire a gun, if you just add more and more powder to a gun, the atmosphere pushes back, and it only makes sense to do that up to a certain point. And that discovery made it clear that you could make guns lighter and use less powder and just be working just on this side of the speed of sound. So this new understanding of atmosphere is part of this. So science is a part of it. And yet there's been a big debate about how much science is important and how much other things are important. And you can kind of typify this historiographical debate by juxtaposing two books against each other. One by Margaret Jacob, Scientific Culture and the Making of the Industrial West, and The Great Divergence by Kenneth Pomerantz. Both of these were published in the late 1990s. And there's been a sort of big debate about it. And basically, to sort of paraphrase and vastly oversimplify, the Great Divergence idea, Kenneth Pomerantz, which is known as the revisionist idea, and many other people have joined that bandwagon, says that it's kind of random. The British had luck. They had luck because their coal was located next to iron and the coal mines were wet. They had luck because they had access to the economies of the New World, which made up for much of the sort of Malthusian restraints, you can say, or the fact that the ecological constraints that were being knocked up against in Great Britain by the rise of population could be eased by using what he calls ghost acreage from the New World. Now there's a whole complicated debate. It's really a great book that you should read at some point. On the other side, Margaret Jacob and people like her say you can't just discount culture. You can't just discount science. And Pomerantz did discount science. He said that it's really more luck than anything. They were in the right place at the right time. And she said, in fact, you have to look at science and what she calls a scientific culture, which is the way that science percolated down into different classes, including, and most notably, an entrepreneurial class of engineers who took scientific ideas like the notion of atmospheric pressure and stuff, and used it to in practical ways to make things. So Pomerantz argues that if you look at how long did it take for a steam engine to be used for anything other than pumping wet water from a coal mine or an iron mine? And it took an enormous amount of time, not because people didn't understand that they might use it someday. Like there's these early designs for steamers, which are kind of fantastic. But it wasn't until 1788, or really a whole lifespan after the first Newcomen engine was set up, that it was actually used for transport. So we have this idea that, and this one, by the way, it sailed 20 miles on the Delaware River before basically the boiler exploded. So from 1712 to 1788, then it took constant experimentation, and that's not to say that it was all about experimentation for the love of knowledge. Really, what it was about was in Great Britain, it was commercially viable to use a steam engine because the mines needed to be cleared of water and the coal was right next to where you needed to clear out that water. If you had to transport the coal, it wouldn't have been economically viable to even use a steam engine because the steam engines were so inefficient. And it's only, according to Pomerantz and a few others, it's only because coal was in wet mines next to iron and you didn't have to transport it that it made any sense at all to use coal to produce power. Coal had been used for heating in London as it was used for heating and cooking in Beijing and other cities. So this is his argument, right? That it's just kind of luck that happens. It's just where the mines were. In China, the coal mines were very dry, so it made no sense to try to have pumps to do it. And the only way you would have used, this was true for generations, any kind of commercial steam engine was for basically pumping dry the place where you actually got the coal. So his arguments, I think, have met some kind of resistance, not just from people making a case sort of like Margaret Jacobs, that science is important, we can't deny science, even though he does, but also from people like this guy, Robert Allen, who argues that we have to also look at other things, the other economic issues, which Pomerantz does, but Robert Allen lays the emphasis on wages and says wages are very, very cheap in China and much more expensive, or labor is more expensive in Europe. And the expense of labor in Europe, and especially in Great Britain, meant that technological fixes were simply more selected for than in China. You could always just hire more people in China because labor costs were low. And in Great Britain, hiring more people only got you so far and was more expensive, so it made sense to try to find other ways to do things. So there was a selection in Great Britain for technological fixes. This is his argument. I think that the debate is still going on. But in any case, and I think that there's another there's another issue in this debate. Who's this? Look at that. That name looks familiar. Huh, that's me. I believe that there's another factor as well. I'm not saying that. I think all of these factors are important, whether economic or luck. I think luck has a role too. I think science is important, but also if you look at the period when China fell behind, you also notice that it's a time when China just didn't fight very much. If you plot war, the number of wars per year from you can't. I don't know how easily you can see this, but you can see over here there were at 1355 or so, the late medieval period in Europe, and this is just before the Ming Dynasty in China. You can see that the number of the warfare in China is relatively constant. There's all these different spikes, but that it gets very, very low here in the middle of the 18th century until the 1830s or so, when the Opium War happens, and then we've got a big spike here. This period is the least warlike in China's history, from about 1740 or so to 1839. This is basically a century in which I call the Great Qing Peace, in which the Qing was unassailable and so didn't go to war a lot. If you compare it with European war, you see this is 1447 around here. Europe is in blue, China in red. You see that the patterns are really kind of even. Until certain periods here, when Europe kind of takes off. This is the Qing dynasty basically. But after Qing consolidation, right around here, you see Chinese warfare fall to its lowest level, even as the British, not just the British, the Europeans are fighting a lot. So one of the arguments of the Gunpowder Age, the book that I just showed you, is that the Chinese, because the Qing were so powerful, faced so few enemies and so little internal, so little need for warfare, that they just kind of atrophied. War is often a challenge response model, right? If someone goes to war against you and they have a good weapon, it is in your interest immediately to copy that weapon, to send out people to do the research. If you don't have a lot of war, why would you waste your money on that? There's much better things to spend money on, like the welfare of people, or building beautiful things. So warfare sort of exists in a sort of challenge response model, and people have often argued that European dynamism was due to the fact that there were these different European states constantly fighting, and China was too unified. I think that is true, but only for the Qing period. Only in the Qing period did the rulers of China really definitively create this massive peace where they didn't have to fight against others. In the Ming Dynasty, which preceded the Qing Dynasty, the Ming were often fighting both within and without. So I think that there's something to be said for just the British were just better practiced at war. They had been doing it more, so they came. Their guns were more advanced. Their gunpowder was better. Their troops were better drilled and better prepared. They found, the British were shocked to find among some of the cannons that they recovered from the enemy, cannons that were made in the 17th century, in the Qing side. So basically, the Qing were in certain cases using guns that had been forged 200 years previously. So that sort of shocked the British, and they chalked it up to Qing backwardness or Chinese backwardness. But what we can really often see it as, I think, is just a lack of focus on war because they didn't need to focus on war. In any case, the Qing lost badly, and in 1842 they signed the Treaty of Nanjing, which ushered in a new period for China. As I said at the outset of this lecture, the Opium War is seen as the beginning of China's modern history. And indeed it did. It began a series of adjustments and responses, and also incursions by the West. So what did the Treaty of Nanjing do? It's often called the first of the unequal treaties, because it stipulated, for one thing, that the Qing must open up other treaty ports. And the original treaty ports are here, the ones that look like eyeballs with round. There were 5 of them in the Treaty of Nanjing. But that in subsequent treaties, this was expanded. And a treaty port was basically a place where the British and others eventually had their own little colony on Chinese soil. So they had their own laws. They could basically build warehouses and stuff like that. Their people were not subject to Chinese law. And they were supposed to be able to trade freely. And so the original treaty ports were Canton in the south, Fuzhou, Ningbo, Shanghai, and wasn't there one more? Anyway, 5 of them under the Treaty of Nanjing. Guangzhou, Xiamen is the other one, which is here. That was also an original treaty port. So the Chinese then kind of had to open their country. They also had to pay a huge indemnity, and that indemnity was massive, $21 million. This was a time when if you lose a war, you basically pay a big fine, and so that's what happened. There were a number of other things too, of which the most important was Hong Kong. Hong Kong, which is very much in the news these days, became a British colony as part of the Treaty of Nanjing. So the Treaty of Nanjing then ushered in this new era. And one of the major consequences of it was that once the British signed this treaty, the other Europeans wanted to join in, and they began to negotiate their own treaties. So the Opium War inaugurates a new era of Sino-Western relations, or Qing-Western relations, an era in which Qing overwhelming power is contested. It also, maybe a little belatedly, begins a process of adjustment in China, because it wasn't the last war. It was followed by another Opium War, Sino-French War. I think I have some charts. Here we go. So this is the second Opium War in 1860, in which the French got involved, sometimes known as the Arrow War. The Sino-French War in the 1880s, the Boxer Rebellion in the 1900s, etc. So China, this is the beginning of a major series of conflicts with the West, but not just with the West, also within China. There are huge new rebellions and things like that. So the 19th century for China is a very tumultuous century. And you can't understand China today without understanding the Opium War and this Chinese century, because the Chinese, and this is the last point I'm going to make, the Chinese current leadership has its own historiographical perspective on the Opium War and the Chinese past, which it calls the 100 Years of National Humiliations, 百年国耻. And basically it holds that China has been rough-handled since 1839 all the way up to 1945, well, 1949 actually they say, which is when the communists took over. And only the communists are able to protect China and keep it strong vis-a-vis all this Western incursions. So this idea that China was nationally humiliated for 100 years, it seems like something maybe you wouldn't want to necessarily remember. You want your country to seem great. I can't imagine Americans saying, oh, we have sucked for 100 years. Not right now anyway. But this is exactly one of the ways that the current regime of China legitimates itself. So people learn about this in school, the Western aggression, and the lesson that China needs to be strong. So I think I will end with that, and as they often say, never forget the 100 years of national humiliation. Thank you.